Every 4 years, the Winter Olympics brings together the fastest, strongest, and bravest athletes in the world, all chasing the same dream of representing their country on the biggest stage in sport. From frozen mountains to towering ice tracks, these games are designed to celebrate human skill in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Events are decided by fractions of a second, and most competitors spend years preparing for a single run, race, or descent. The games are known for their organisation and high safety standards, and serious accidents are rare. In more than a century of competition, only 4 athletes have lost their lives during the Olympic events or official training. Because of how uncommon this is, each case has had a lasting impact on the sport. They have led to changes in the rules, venue designs, and safety procedures. The athletes involved were experienced professionals, but even with preparation and oversight, sport at this level can never be completely risk-free. Sometimes, despite everything being in place, things still go wrong, and today I will be examining each case of death there has been at the Winter Olympic Games. So let's talk about it. To understand how these tragedies happened, it is important to look at the history of the Winter Olympics and the types of events involved. When the Games began in 1924, the programme was relatively small, focusing mainly on skating, skiing, and ice hockey. Over the following decades, new disciplines were introduced as technology and training methods improved. Events such as luge, bobsleigh, alpine skiing, and ski jumping brought higher speeds, steeper courses, and greater challenges. By the 1950s and 60s, some competitors were reaching speeds that had never been seen before in winter sport. This forced organisers to rethink how venues were built, how courses were prepared, and how accidents were handled. Safety nets, crash barriers, padded walls, and improved protective equipment became more common. Medical teams were placed closer to competition areas, and emergency procedures were formalised. Qualification standards were also tightened to ensure only experienced athletes could compete. By the late 20th century, the Winter Olympics had become one of the most professionally managed sporting events in the world. Even so, certain disciplines continued to involve unavoidable risks, particularly those based on downhill racing and sliding on ice tracks. The first of these tragedies took place in 1964 at the 1964 Winter Olympics in the city of Innsbruck, Austria. These games were seen as a major step forward for winter sport. New venues had been built, international participation was growing, and many events were becoming faster and more competitive than ever before. Austria, with its strong skiing tradition and mountainous terrain, was considered an ideal host. That year, competing at the games was, and I'm sorry if I get this wrong, Kazimierz Kay-Skrzypecki, a competitor in the newly introduced sport of luge. He was born in 1905 in Borislav. He later settled in Britain and went on to serve as a pilot in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. After leaving military service, he developed an interest in winter sports and eventually became involved in luge, a discipline that involves sliding feet first on a small sled down an ice track at high speed. Unlike many of his rivals, who had grown up around alpine sports, Kay-Skrzypecki only took up luge later in life. Despite this, he committed himself to training and earned a place on the British Olympic team. By the time of the 1964 Winter Olympics, he was 58 years old, making him one of the oldest competitors at the Games. His presence reflected the early nature of Olympic luge and attracting athletes from a wide range of backgrounds. For him, simply qualifying to compete on the world's biggest stage was already a significant achievement, especially in a sport that was making its Olympic debut. Edward Fender, one of Poland's best luge riders and member of the 1964 Polish team, said, "Before the games began, he lived with us and we trained together. He was an artist, a painter, and he painted our portraits on the spot. A very nice man. But at that age, he shouldn't be competing." Just days before the opening ceremony, he was taking part in the official training on the luge track in Igls, where the Olympic sliding events were being held. Luge was making its first appearance at the Winter Games, and many athletes were still adjusting to the demands of the course. The track was fast, technical, and according to later reports, difficult to control in places. Sources have suggested that crashes during training were not uncommon, and several competitors struggled to complete clean runs. During one of his practice descents on January the 21st, Kay-Skrzypecki lost control of his sled at high speed. He was thrown down the track and crashed heavily onto the surrounding ground, travelling several metres before coming to a stop. Medical staff reached him, and he was quickly taken to hospital for emergency treatment. Doctors diagnosed multiple serious injuries, including fractures to his skull and pelvis, as well as broken bones in his arm. Despite the severity of the crash, he briefly regained consciousness in the hospital the following day, leading to hopes that he might recover. However, this wasn't the case. Surgeons attempted emergency surgery, and doctors worked to stabilise his condition, even resorting to heart massage when his condition deteriorated. However, on January the 22nd, he died from his injuries. His death came as preparations for the games were entering their final stages, with hundreds of athletes already in Innsbruck. Flags were lowered to half-staff, and a minute's silence was observed in his memory. The incident raised immediate concerns about the safety of the luge track, but no clear conclusion was ever reached over whether the crash was caused by a fault in the course, equipment, or simply the loss of control. After his death, his family travelled to Austria, and his body was later returned to Poland for burial in Krakow. His death was already a heavy blow to the organisers and athletes, but it would not be the only tragedy to occur in Innsbruck. Just 3 days later, during the same 1964 Winter Olympics, another competitor would lose his life. This time it involved Ross Milne, a 19-year-old alpine skier from Australia who had travelled to Austria for his first Olympic appearance. One of the key competitions was alpine skiing, which by this point had become one of the most popular and demanding events in the Winter Olympics. Downhill racing in particular pushed athletes to extreme speeds on long, steep courses carved into the mountainside. Racers had to navigate icy surfaces, sharp turns, and changing weather conditions, often at over 60 miles per hour with little room for error. In 1964, equipment was far more basic than it is today. Helmets were minimal, protective padding was limited, and safety fencing was still developing. Ross had grown up in Myrtleford in Victoria, where his family ran a tobacco farm. He learned to ski in the Australian Alps at Falls Creek. Despite limited resources and support compared to European teams, he developed into one of Australia's strongest downhill skiers and had already spent a season racing in Europe before being selected for the Olympic team. At the time, Australia was still considered an outsider in alpine sport. His selection reflected the country's determination to establish itself on the winter sports stage. Teammates later described him as hard-working, level-headed, and naturally talented. On January the 25th, 1964, Ross Milne was taking part in official training for the men's downhill event on the slopes of Patscherkofel. Preparations for the games had been affected by a lack of natural snow, and large amounts had been brought in by the army to build the course. This created an extremely fast run, but one with little natural protection, as trees, rocks, and bare ground lay close to the edge of the piste. During his training run, Milne reached speeds of more than 60 miles per hour before encountering a group of skiers stopped further down the course. Attempting to avoid them, he tried to slow and change direction on a section not designed for stopping. He lost control, left the course, and collided with a tree at high speed. He was taken from the slope unconscious and flown by helicopter to hospital, but was pronounced dead shortly after arrival from severe head injuries. An official inquiry later concluded that Milne had caught an edge and lost control, placing responsibility largely on the skier himself. However, members of the Australian team strongly disagreed. His team manager, John Wagner, argued that overcrowding on the course had created a dangerous situation, with around 100 racers training at the same time. He believed the crash could have been prevented if runs had been more carefully managed and spaced out. However, some European commentators and the organisers suggested that Milne lacked experience, and they raised questions about whether athletes from non-traditional winter nations should be competing in such events. These claims obviously angered the Australians tremendously, and were rejected. They pointed out that Milne had competed for several years and had already raced in Europe. His teammates also insisted that he was capable and controlled, and that the circumstances of the training session played a major role in the accident. Following Milne's death, Small safety changes were made to the course, including extra gates to reduce speed and additional padding on trees. An emotional memorial service was held in the Olympic Village, and his loss deeply affected Australia's small team. Some athletes withdrew from the competition, whilst others chose to race in his memory. His younger brother, Malcolm Milne, later went on to become one of Australia's most successful skiers, motivated in part by the criticism that followed Ross's death that the Australians shouldn't even be there. He proved them all wrong. Together, these two deaths cast a shadow over the opening of the 1964 Games and forced organisers to confront serious questions about training conditions and athlete safety, and it was clear that these were addressed as there wasn't another death until 1992. However, throughout the Winter Olympics history, there has been some very close calls. Perhaps the most famous close call in Winter Olympics history involved Hermann Maier at the 1998 Winter Olympics. On February the 13th, during the men's downhill, Maier was one of the favourites for gold, having dominated the World Cup season leading into the Games. When Maier launched from the start gate, he quickly built up speed, reaching more than 100 km per hour as he approached one of the most difficult turns on the course. His line was too direct, and he failed to adjust in time. He lost control and was launched off the piste, flying several metres through the air before crashing into the snow beyond the safety barriers. The images were broadcast around the world and immediately raised fears that he had been seriously injured. Remarkably, after a few moments, Maier stood up, covered in snow, and signalled to the crowd that he was unhurt. He escaped with heavy bruising to his shoulder and knee, but avoided any life-threatening injuries. Just 3 days later, he returned to competition and won the gold in the Super G. A few days after that, he then added another gold. The most recent example of a crash where everyone had their hearts in their mouths was that of Lindsey Vonn. By the time Vonn retired in 2019, she was already regarded as one of the greatest alpine skiers of all time. Her career included multiple Olympic medals, World Cup titles, and more downhill victories than any woman in history. It had also been shaped by injury. Over the years, she had suffered serious knee ligament damage, fractures, concussions, and chronic pain that required repeated surgeries. By her mid-30s, simply being able to walk without discomfort had become a challenge, and retirement seemed unavoidable. In 2024 and 2025, Vonn surprised many by announcing her intention to attempt a competitive comeback, with the long-term goal of qualifying for the 2026 Games. By then, she would be in her 40s, returning to a sport that had already taken a physical toll on her body. Her decision was widely admired, but it also raised concerns. Just 9 days before the event, she had ruptured ligaments in her left knee, adding to a long history of serious injuries and surgeries. Despite this, she remained determined to compete, believing that she had a realistic chance for contending for a medal. Her comeback reached its defining moment on the downhill course in Cortina d'Ampezzo, where she had enjoyed major success earlier in her career. Shortly after leaving the start gate, travelling at high speed, Vonn clipped a gate with her shoulder and was thrown violently off balance. She cartwheeled down the slope before coming to a rest on her back, screaming in pain as the medical teams rushed to her side. The race was immediately stopped, and a hush fell over the finish area as she was treated on the piste for several minutes. She was then placed on a stretcher and airlifted by helicopter to hospital. Doctors later confirmed that she had suffered a complex fracture to her left tibia, which required surgery and further treatment. In the days that followed, Vonn underwent multiple operations, and she will begin a long recovery process. Despite the severity of her injury, she insists that she has no regrets. She said that simply standing in the start gate knowing she still had a chance to win was a victory in itself. While some questioned whether she should have raced in her condition, teammates and fellow athletes defended her decision, pointing out that she fully understood the risks involved. I wish her well in her recovery. Unfortunately, a story of recovery would not be the case for the individual in our next case of death, which occurred in 1992. Before the events of 1992, Nicolas Bochatay was already well established within the small but highly competitive world of speed skiing. Born in Switzerland in 1963, he grew up in a country with a strong alpine tradition and learned to ski from a young age. Over time, he gravitated towards speed skiing, one of the most extreme disciplines in winter sports, where athletes race straight down steep slopes with the single aim of reaching the highest speed possible. Nicolas proved himself well suited to the demands of the sport and became one of Switzerland's leading competitors during the late 1980s and early 1990s. In 1991, he won the overall World Cup title in speed skiing, confirming his status as one of the best in the world. By the time of the 1992 Winter Olympics, he was considered one of the favourites in the demonstration events and arrived in France at the peak of his career. On the morning of the 22nd of February, Nicolas was warming up on a public slope near his teammate and several members of the United States team. They had already completed a number of runs and were using a small bump in the slope to become briefly airborne. At around 9:30 am, during one of these warm-up descents, he went over the rise and landed directly in front of a snow grooming machine that was positioned just out of view behind the hill. Travelling at a high speed, he had no time to react and collided with the vehicle. He suffered severe internal injuries and was pronounced dead shortly after the impact. In the hours that followed, conflicting accounts emerged about the circumstances of the accident. Organisers and some witnesses stated that the machine had flashing lights and a siren activated and may have been moving uphill. Members of the Swiss team disputed this, claiming it was stationary and that warning lights were either not present or not visible in time. Regardless of these differences, the central issue remained the same. A heavy vehicle had been allowed onto an active slope where athletes were cresting a blind rise at speed, creating a situation in which a serious accident was almost impossible to avoid. The incident shocked athletes, officials, and viewers around the world. Unlike many crashes in winter sports, Bochatay's death was not caused by a technical error or loss of control, but by a failure in course management and communication. Questions were immediately raised about how such a breakdown could occur at an Olympic venue in 1992, where safety standards were expected to be at their highest. In the aftermath, speed skiing was removed from the Olympic programme and has never returned, even as a demonstration event. Organisers also reviewed procedures surrounding vehicle access, course clearance, and communication systems, particularly in high-speed disciplines. After his death, safety procedures were tightened once again, and communication systems were improved. Yet, as history would show, even with modern technology, stricter regulations, and decades of experience, tragedy could still strike. In 2010, at the Winter Games in Vancouver, another fatal accident would once again force the Olympic world to confront the limits of safety. This one has already been covered on my channel before. I've done a whole video about it. So if you have seen it, feel free to click off this video now, but if you haven't, the next case is that of the luge disaster of 2010. Nodar was born on November the 25th, 1988, in Borjomi, Georgia. He grew up in Bakaroani, a small mountain town known for its ski resorts, where his family had long been involved in the sport of luge. His grandfather, Aliko, had played a key role in introducing luge to Georgia, building the country's first track in the 1970s. His father, David, was a champion in both luge and bobsleigh, passing down his passion for the sport to his son. Luge, in case you didn't know, is a high-speed winter sport where athletes race down an icy track on a small sled, lying feet first and face up, steering with subtle movements. It is one of the fastest Olympic sports, with speeds often exceeding 80 miles per hour, making it both fun to watch and highly dangerous if things go wrong. With limited facilities and resources in Georgia, he often had to train in less than ideal conditions. Yet, he remained determined, refining his technique and pushing himself to compete at the international level. His hard work paid off when he qualified to represent Georgia at the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver. For him, it was a dream, a chance to bring pride to his country on the world stage. His journey to the Olympics was anything but easy. He competed in various luge events across Europe, gaining experience and improving his rankings. Though he was not considered a medal contender, his qualification for the Olympics was a significant achievement for both him and Georgian winter sports. It was a moment of great pride, not just for his family, but for the entire country, which had few athletes competing in such a high-profile event. Arriving in Vancouver, Nodar was eager but cautious. Concerns had already been raised about the Whistler Sliding Centre, a track unlike any the world had ever seen. It was the fastest luge track ever built, with athletes reaching unprecedented speeds of nearly 93 miles per hour. Several competitors, coaches, and experts had voiced concerns about its safety. Some called it unnecessarily dangerous, arguing that even the most experienced lugers were struggling to maintain control. Athletes had even nicknamed Turn 13 the 50-50 turn, reflecting their perceived chances of navigating it without crashing. Despite this, the track remained unchanged in the days leading up to the competition. Athletes including Nodar had little choice but to adapt. He was among many who found the course particularly challenging, crashing multiple times during the practice runs. But like any athlete chasing his dream, he pushed forward, determined to prove himself on the world's biggest stage. On February the 12th, 2010, just hours before the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics, Nodar took what was supposed to be a routine final training run. The pressure was high, and though he had struggled with certain turns in previous runs, he was focused on improving his time and confidence heading into the competition. As he launched himself down the 1,450 metre track, he quickly gained speed. His sled, barely under control, cut through the ice at a rapid speed. Within seconds, he was moving at a staggering 89 miles per hour, one of the highest speeds ever recorded in Olympic luge history. He managed to navigate the early curves, but the final turn proved fatal. Approaching the 16th and final curve, known as Thunderbird, Nodar struggled to maintain control. His sled drifted too high on the icy walls. He attempted to correct his trajectory, but at such speeds, even the smallest miscalculation had devastating consequences. In an instant, his sled slammed against the wall, flipping him onto his side. The force sent him crashing out of the track's boundaries. Unlike most luge tracks, which are enclosed for safety, Whistler's design left gaps in the upper walls, a flaw that would prove deadly. Before he had any chance to recover, Nodar was violently thrown from his sled, spinning through the air at full speed, and then impact. Nodar's body crashed into an unpadded steel support beam at full force. The collision was so severe that he went completely limp on impact. The sound of the crash was heard through the sliding centre as onlookers gasped in horror. His sled continued to slide down the track without him. Track officials and paramedics rushed to his side within seconds. The scene was chaotic as medics performed CPR on the ice, desperately trying to revive him, but the damage had already been done. The force of the impact had caused severe head and spinal injuries, leaving no chance of survival. At 1:59 p.m, Nodar was pronounced dead. He was only 21 years old. The accident was captured on camera, and within minutes, the footage spread across the world. In the aftermath of the crash, an investigation was launched to determine what had gone wrong. The official report concluded that the accident was caused by an error on Nodar's part, stating that he had lost control of his sled and reacted too late to correct his position. This explanation was met with widespread criticism. Many experts and fellow athletes argued that the track itself was unsafe. Several lugers had already suffered crashes in training, and numerous competitors had warned officials about the extreme speeds. Faced with mounting pressure, Olympic officials took immediate action. Hours after the crash, they made last-minute modifications to the track. First, the walls of Curve 16 were raised to prevent another ejection, and then, the starting position for the men's luge was lowered, reducing overall speeds. Despite these changes, many felt it was too little, too late. The decision to lower the start point in particular was seen as an admission that the original design had pushed athletes beyond reasonable limits. His death sent shockwaves to the Olympics and beyond. The Georgian Olympic team considered withdrawing from the Games, but ultimately decided to stay and compete in his honour. The autopsy report would later confirm people's concerns with the tracks. He died from multiple blunt force injuries due to a combination of factors contributing to the accident, including the track's high speed and its technical complexity. No individuals or organisations were criminally charged or held legally responsible for the tragic death of Nodar. Investigations, including a report by the British Columbia Coroner's Service, concluded that his death was accidental. The coroner report also stated that the accident may have happened due to his lack of experience, but his father angrily said, "I don't accept the statement about Nodar's lack of experience. He wouldn't have won the right to take part in the Olympics if he lacked experience." In 2013, engineering professor Mont Hubbard suggested that a track design flaw, which was a small joint in the curve, may have launched Nodar off his sled. His theory, however, was dismissed due to lack of data. Nodar's tragic death forced the luge community to confront serious safety concerns. In the years that followed, several important reforms were introduced. Track designs were re-evaluated, prioritising safety over speed, and athlete safety measures were improved too, including better protective gear and sled designs. Nodar's funeral took place in his hometown on February 20th, 2010. Thousands of mourners gathered, including family, friends, and government officials. A small choir sang Georgian chants, and his portrait was displayed during the service, and he was buried near a local church he had attended growing up. May he rest in peace. As always, this is not an AI channel, I do everything myself, so if you appreciate my work, subscribe, and if you want to go that extra step to support the channel, maybe consider becoming a member. Let me know what you thought about this case in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching.